Hola chicos, bienvenidos a esta clase sobre objetos indirectos. Mi nombre es Andrea Villada y si no lo saben, recuerden que es necesario mirar las clases previas sobre objeto directo para que esta clase tenga sentido. Pueden encontrar la información de esta clase en los links que están en la cajita de descripción en Buy Me a Coffee y van a encontrar ejercicios. And if you want to support my content, you can buy me a coffee because after all, I'm Colombian and I love coffee. You know that. First of all, a little review. Remember when we were studying direct objects, I told you direct objects are people or things that receive an action directly. And you can identify them by asking these two questions. ¿Qué cosa? What thing? ¿A quién? Who? Today we need to learn how to identify the indirect objects. In our next class, we're going to focus on the pronouns, but today it's only about identifying because, guys, you need to keep them separated. You need to take a look to the sentence and learn if this is direct or indirect because that's what's going to help you decide between the pronouns you need to use every time. Indirect objects are usually people, that receive an action indirectly. They receive the action through the direct object. This is only understood with examples. If I knock the door, right? Let's say this is the door. Yo toco la puerta. I knock the door. That is direct object, right? Because the door is receiving the action directly. I'm knocking directly the door, right? That's going to be direct. If my intention is for you to open the door for me, I'm not knocking you, but I'm certainly directing my action, my knocking to you. Why? Because I want you to hear it so I can make you open the door for me. I can make you listen. So I knock the door for you to open it, right? I'm not knocking you. That would be a completely different scenario, right? Where I knock you. But no, it's just for you to open the door so you become my indirect object. So that's kind of the idea of indirect objects. I'm directing my action towards somebody. I'm not applying the action on that person. That's a different thing. That would be direct object. I'm just doing it so you receive it somehow, not directly but through my direct object, which in this particular case would be the door. So that's basically how it works. So in a sentence like the one in my example, it would be yo toco la puerta a María. In that case, María is my indirect object and la puerta would be directo. Let's see another example. Yo compro un regalo para mis hijos. So I'm not buying my children. No, that's not what I'm doing. I'm buying gifts, presents. And then they get those presents for them. The children are my indirect object. If we already asked some questions to the direct object, ¿qué cosa? ¿A quién? The questions we need to ask the verb in order to identify correctly the indirect object are ¿para quién? For whom? ¿A quién? To whom? Let's see how they work. Yo compro regalos para mis hijos. Yo compro. ¿Qué cosa? Regalos, direct object. ¿Para quién? Para mis hijos. Indirect object. Otro ejemplo. Yo leo un libro a mis hijos. Yo leo. ¿Qué cosa? Un libro, direct object. ¿A quién? A mis hijos. Indirect object. These questions allow two prepositions, a and para, which are to and for in English. There are verbs that can use para, and there are verbs that can use a. They're very similar in English and in Spanish. Sometimes you guys use to, and sometimes you use for. In Spanish, thankfully, there's no need to think about these prepositions. A works for indirect objects every time. So I could be saying, yo compro regalos para mis hijos, but if I say, yo compro regalos a mis hijos, that works. A is a preposition that works every time. Para doesn't work every time. So my personal recommendation is, if you don't know which preposition to use, always use a. Besides, this is the one that we prefer. So for indirect objects, you can use a every time, and you'll be right. Now, let's see the things we need to keep in mind when thinking about indirect objects. The first thing we need to keep in mind is they're usually a person. But you can't forget that a person can also be direct object. The students tend to think after indirect object class that indirect objects are people and direct objects are things. Direct objects can be both people and things. Indirect objects are mainly people. When you have just people as objects in your sentence, you need to make sure if you're going to use pronouns, you are using the right pronoun. The direct object if the person is direct, or the indirect object pronoun if the person is indirect. They can be both. People can be direct and indirect. The second thing you need to remember is that there's no indirect object if we don't have a direct one. It's just impossible. We need to have direct object in order to find an indirect one. We might have an indirect object or not, but if we have an indirect object, it's because we have a direct one. We can't skip the first step. It's just like a list of steps. Direct object, indirect object. If there's no direct object, then there's no indirect object. It's as simple as that. Third thing you need to remember is you need to identify the direct object first. And the first question you need to ask the verb in order to do this right every time is the question what. Ella compra ¿qué? Regalos. The second question is going to be ¿a quién? We might have an indirect object or not. But if we don't start by finding the direct object, you might make some mistakes. Start by the direct object and always with the question what. Fourth thing, if our direct object is a person, then you probably don't have an indirect object. For instance, if I say, yo visito a mis padres, let's start with the first question. I visit what? ¿Qué cosa? It doesn't answer because definitely my parents aren't things. They're people. So if I say, okay, so what thing? It's not a question I need right now. I already checked. So my next question is, I visit whom? Which is the second question for direct object. I visit whom? My parents. And that's it. I don't have an indirect object. I can't visit my parents to somebody else. It wouldn't make any sense. So if a person is your direct object, just stop it right there. You don't have to keep looking for an indirect object. Fifth, remember we can always use a with our indirect objects. But that comes with another thing and with another issue. The use of a can be very easy, but it has another characteristic that makes it a little bit peculiar. That characteristic is something we're going to find out in our next class with the use of pronouns for indirect objects. Guys, I hope you understood this class and that you're able to identify the indirect objects already. Let's take a little practice here. Let's identify the direct and indirect objects in these sentences. Yo digo un secreto a mis amigas. Yo digo, ¿qué cosa? Un secreto, objeto directo. ¿A quiénes? A mis amigas, objeto indirecto, mis amigas. Yo explico los objetos directos a los estudiantes. Yo explico ¿qué cosa? Los objetos indirectos. ¿A quiénes? A los estudiantes, objeto indirecto. Mis amigos escriben cartas a sus novias. Mis amigos escriben ¿qué cosa? Cartas. ¿A quiénes? A sus novias. Tú respetas a tu familia. ¿Tú respetas qué cosa? We have no answer for that, so let's move on to our next direct object question. ¿A quién? A tu familia. So your family is direct object. We don't have an indirect object here. Guys, I hope you understood it. See you in our next class with the pronouns. Bye. Ciao, ciao.